In 1993, a judicial case was initiated against the oil giant Chevron Texaco by the 30,000 indigenous people and farmers from the Ecuadorian Amazon rainforest. The case is 30 years old, and still there is no remediation. I am exactly as old as the Chevron case. In the picture, I was 23, and I stood close to Donald Moncayo, one of the key activists of the fight against Chevron Texaco, a person extremely knowledgeable of the local impacts of oil extraction. In Ecuador, I witnessed local people taking action, gathering evidence through civic environmental monitoring to offer alternative evidence to those of governments and corporations to document and resist new environmental injustices. At the time, I didn't know how to frame all this, but I understood its potential. Later on, I called these people witnesses, civic sentinels, nowheres. Civic environmental monitoring is essentially about detecting environmental issues just using our own senses or simple monitoring devices. Many years later, I was again observing oil pollution, again accompanied by civic sentinels that were documenting the impact of extractive operations. Can you guess where I am this time? It could seem, again, Ecuador. But no. Actually, that picture was taken a few hours away from where I was born, the city of Rome. In the picture, I'm in the south of Italy, in the oil-rich region of Basilicata, a European hub for oil extraction, the heaven for extractive companies, but the hell for the local inhabitants. In my work, I witnessed that oil is the same everywhere, but also the sentinels are. They are experts by experience. In other words, these people became extremely knowledgeable of the social and environmental externalities associated with oil extraction, just for being exposed daily to these stressors, like Donald Moncayo, the activist that I introduced to you earlier. In my work, I witnessed that civic evidence of environmental harm were often discarded by authorities because considered not legally or scientifically valid. So I follow the footprints of the civic sentinel to demonstrate that civic environmental monitoring can be a powerful antidote against environmental injustices. I'm an environmental lawyer, and I lead the Sensing for Justice project. My mission is to offer to concerned people resources on the admissibility of civic evidence of environmental harm. I give these people the resources to understand the law, for example, offering them spaces to ask a legal question and sharing best practices. Civic evidence can enter court for change. Let me introduce to you Diane Wilson, shrimper and award-winning activist. She and her fellow shrimpers from Texas documented the illicit discharge of plastic pellets in their bay, perpetrated over years by a petrochemical company in the absence of proper institutional monitoring. And they used just what they had, a kayak and a few buckets to collect plastic pollution. To bring the law to the civic sentinels, I go where the people are, through slow, engaged research on the field. For example, taking my backpack and walking through the field studied. This way, I can truly engage with the local context and perceive the feeling of a certain land, of its inhabitants. This also helped me to deconstruct some of the power hierarchies and barriers that may be at stake when a researcher enters the field studied. I also identify which barriers need to be removed to open space for civic evidence of environmental harm. For example, combating the fear that environmental defenders have to be criminalized just for doing their job. Identify the legal resources to help them face adverse consequences from their action. You also use art to illustrate complex legal meaning and trigger emotions. For example, we created Story of a Civic Sentinel, a graphic novel that tells the story of a girl facing oil pollution in her land. We bring these resources to public spaces, such as libraries, parks, and schools. Applying our approaches, we noticed a number of changes. Communities affected by environmental issues start realizing the judicial potential of the evidence that they gather. Legal practitioners, scientists, institutions are turning to us with interest and ask how they can support the sentinels. And youngsters are become curious about civic environmental monitoring and want to become the sentinels of the future. But we still have several challenges ahead. For example, we must understand better how communities exposed to climate stressors are documenting climate change to urge governments and corporations to take action. Especially those communities living in the space more exposed to climate change, which are often also the more marginalized, are gathering evidence that could potentially be very informative to document local impacts of climate change. Think to the potential of connecting local impacts of climate change to larger trends gathered by institutions. Foregrounding the knowledge on climate change of those people living in the so-called climate hotspot would be truly game changer. Let's do together a jump back in history. We've always been sensing, just using our own senses for our survival. And this is a pristine form of civic environmental monitoring. But over time, through the development of modern society, we largely delegate this responsibility for monitoring our environment to appointed institutions. But environmental crimes that recurrently manifested in history demonstrated that we cannot blindly delegate the responsibility for protecting our health and environment only to institutions. People are taking back the sense. And doing so, they become extremely knowledgeable of the local impacts of environmental harm. They strive for the inclusion of different knowledge systems to form the decisions that affect our environment. Doing so, they form what I called a sensing contract, a new social contract based on the distribution of the responsibility for monitoring our environment across several actors that have as many eyes and senses as the sentinels have. We cannot achieve environmental justice if we exclude the knowledge of those people that are more affected but also more knowledgeable about environmental harm. A truly inclusive approach to environmental governance demands epistemic diversity. Epistemic diversity is the inclusion of multiple knowledge systems, of multiple eyes and senses to form the evidence on which environmental decisions are taken. We cannot assume that the responsibility for monitoring our environment lays only in the hands of institutions. We have a shared responsibility, which is a duty, but also a right. Everyone can be a sentinel, just using our own senses, or when needed, simple monitoring devices. Sentinels are active all over the world and building synergies with scientists, activists, and legal professionals to change the way we monitor our environment. After this talk, from wherever you listen, to remember that you are truly a sentinel.